Good afternoon. Welcome to Morehouse College and to this phase of the celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Atlanta student movement. Morehouse is pleased to be one of the host sites for the series of events of this particular celebration. Here we strive to produce Renaissance men, men who are globally competent and socially responsible. Alton Hornsby's historical account of the Atlanta student movement, reflected in his book Black Power and Dixie, A Political History of African Americans in Atlanta, recalls that desegregation efforts were moving slowly in Atlanta. There were no serious incidents, he writes, probably because most blacks continued to observe Jim Crow arrangements and customs. Meanwhile, an incident in Greensboro, North Carolina on February 1st, 1960, upset all of the predictions about racial relations in Atlanta's future. 4 young black college students sat down at a previously all-white lunch counter and defied orders to move. The lunch counter movement spread from Greensboro across the South like wildfire. The Georgia legislature rushed through a special anti-trespass law on February 17, 1960. The legislature did not know that black students in the Atlanta University Center had met 3 days after the Greensboro sit-in to discuss plans for an assault on lunch counter Jim Crow in Atlanta. The black college administrators persuaded the students to postpone the launching of the sit-in movement in Atlanta. Instead, they worked with them in the preparation and publication of an anti-bias statement called An Appeal for Human Rights. Black leaders praised the restraint of the students. The Atlanta style seemed triumphant for a while. But on March 15th, 1960, black students hit downtown Atlanta, Hornsby writes, with the sit-in blitz. Under the state's new anti-trespass law, 77 arrests were made. The Young Turks had defied their elders' pleas for continued restraint. It was hardly an accident that Lonnie King, a Morehouse student, was co-leader of the movement. He had sat in the old Cell Hall Chapel each Tuesday morning and heard Benjamin Mays say that segregation was legally and morally wrong, and that he, sometimes under the threat of physical violence, had been made to adhere to it, but had never accepted it. They sat in so that we could stand up. They sat in and now challenge us to stand up. I'm reminded of Emerson's essay, Circles, that sort of speaks to me about what our challenge is. And Emerson writes, "Our life is an apprenticeship to the truth, that around every circle another can be drawn, that there is no end in nature, but every end is a beginning, that there is always another dawn risen at mid-noon, and every deep, a lower deep opens." We're challenged. We're challenged. We're challenged by the Atlanta student movement to lower that, to find the next deep, to draw that circle around what we've been beneficiaries of. In a sense, this is holy ground. I'm not going to be moved by Moses and take my shoes off, but this is in fact holy ground where the leaders of the movement have come back to talk to us about the fact that on March 15th, 1960, Atlanta was hit with a blitz, and a blitz that was told around the world. Let me call upon this point Lydia Tucker to further introduce the panel and to take charge of this program. But again, thank you for coming to Morehouse, and we know that this will be a productive and enlightening panel discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Lydia Tucker Arnold. and I have served as the chairperson for this particular part of our anniversary. I would like to call Judge Brenda Cole to the podium to welcome you.
Good afternoon. As co-chair of the Planning Committee for this 50th anniversary celebration, I am very pleased to welcome you. We could not have done this whole week's activities without the help of a wonderful planning committee, and as I give this greeting, I would like for the planning committee members who are here to please stand. We want to particularly welcome the students. We hope that you will participate in this discussion. As our secondary theme has been, we have come to look back, to look forward. And I would also like to add, to plan for the next struggle. I also want to thank all of our sponsors, in particular, Ms. Vicki Crawford and the Morehouse King Papers, for hosting this event and for being such a vital member of the Planning Committee, and all of our other sponsors, which include the Atlanta University Center Schools. Thank you very much.
We are so honored to have the president of the City Council to bring greetings to us today, Mr. Cesar Mitchell.
Well, good afternoon. We're going to try that one more time. The men up here in the balcony. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It really is indeed a pleasure to be here. I am honored and thankful that Judge Cole and the members of the Planning Committee thought enough of the City Council and City Government to invite us out to bring greetings on behalf of the City of Atlanta, Mayor Kasim Reed and the entire City Council and the over 500,000 citizens who call Atlanta home. But I must admit, I really don't feel as if I'm here as a representative of the City Council or of the City of Atlanta or of the mayor. Indeed, 9 of the 17 elected officials here in the City of Atlanta and city government are graduates of HBCUs. I don't think you could find that anywhere else in the country. And that is in part due to the tremendous legacy that the leaders of the student movement left for us while they were here as students and as they did work beyond college in providing leadership not only here in the Atlanta community but all over the world. So I'm indeed here really as a fan and I am here as someone who is a graduate of Morehouse College and the beneficiary of the work and the struggle and the foresight and the leadership and the legacy that has been left for me and for many others as we go about providing leadership here in this city. So it's indeed a pleasure to be here. I'll leave with this little comment. Last night I had dinner with John Reed, who is Vice President, Senior Vice President, Executive Vice President at the Coca-Cola Company. And we got into this conversation about Atlanta and forming an image or creating a new image statement for Atlanta, much like one would call a marketing kind of tool for the city. And he gravitated in this conversation to this whole notion of Atlanta as a center of freedom. And it struck me because what he used as his example were the many years and decades that we have spent here in the city cultivating a relationship within our community that embraced diversity, that valued getting things done, that understood how important civil rights was to our struggle, but also human rights. And so as he thought about this whole notion of civil rights and human rights and the embracing of diversity and inclusion, he said this really is about freedom. And so he said we really ought to engage in a campaign that develops that concept, the concept of freedom, as kind of the cornerstone of Atlanta, and create an image of this city around the notion of freedom. He would not be able to say that. He would not even be able to conceptualize that thought or that idea or that vision for what we might do in terms of marketing our city in the days ahead, if he didn't have the benefit of the history that many of the students in the student movement created, their efforts, their toil. So I'm here indeed, again, as a beneficiary, but also someone to say thank you for the work that you've done and the vision that you give us that will carry us into the future as a city which is the center of freedom. Thank you all.
Mr. Mitchell took time out from a very busy schedule to be with us today, so we are very thankful to him and appreciative for him coming. Mr. Johnny Parham will give us the occasion at this time.
This week of celebration actually began on Monday at the Atlanta History Center and will appropriately end on Saturday here at the Atlanta University Center at the Thomas Cole Science Building. And it's appropriate because this is actually where the revolution began. But that revolution actually began years ago here on this center. In your history classes, you should have learned about the sociology series that were begun by W.E.B. Du Bois, and how there was an ongoing intellectual struggle between Du Bois and the Tuskegee machine, headed by Booker Washington. All of this, basically, this intellectual power was vested here in this center. And so you who are students today are heirs to that undergirding. And so for this panel, it's here continuing the tradition of challenging you to raise questions, to raise issues, to stimulate thought, and to plot a future, not only for your personal well-being, but for your community. And so we are honored to be here on the campus of Morehouse, an appropriate site, an appropriate venue. But we are also flattered to return to the Atlanta University Center overall and to continue what will ultimately be continued by you in the years to follow. But that then is the occasion around which we're gathered today. We want to thank you so much for being here.
Now we get to the part of the program that we've been waiting for. With a sandwich, there's always 2 pieces of bread and the meat. So we've had 1 piece of bread. Now we're going to get the meat, and we'll close it out with another piece of bread. Okay? All right. Each panelist has been asked to speak for 10 minutes each. We're going to ask you to write your questions down and hold them until the last panelist has finished. And then we will be happy to entertain any questions that you have. I will introduce each panelist as that person comes forward. So the first person is Dr. Herschelle Challenor. And all of these persons are distinguished in their respective fields, and I am not going to take time away from them reading a long bio. I told them that I would not do that, but I want to tell you what they were doing at the time that they were students here in the University Center. Dr. Sullivan Challenor was president of the student body at Spelman College, and she was co-chair of the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. And I hope that you will someone will write a question, how was the Committee on Appeal formed? I want to answer that question at the end of the session. Okay? All right. Dr. Challenor.
Thank you very much, Lydia. It's really a pleasure to be here at Morehouse. I'm particularly attached to Morehouse by way of background. My father was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Morehouse College in the mid-30s, and then got a master's from Atlanta University in mathematics. My sister, Dr. Paula Sullivan-Berry, who's here, was Miss Maroon and White, and Dr. John Handy, my cousin, is currently tenured professor and has been the chair of the economics department here at Morehouse College. So I'm a Grady baby, but we left when I was 4 years old. My father wanted to go to engineering school, and of course then he couldn't get into Georgia Tech. And so we left, my mother, who was a graduate of Spelman, we left, and he got his degree from Carnegie Tech. But I'm delighted to say that my sister's daughter, Kathleen Sullivan Van Supfen, got her degree in engineering from Georgia Tech. My remarks will concentrate briefly on some observations about the Atlanta student movement. And I have about 8 observations, and then I've got 9 challenges. But I want to say to President of City Council how pleased we are that he's here. But please, let us be known as a city not just for freedom, but for justice. You know, white people always talk about freedom, and I think it's so important that we link the two. I want to talk about our concerns about justice. Let me just say, when I first came to Atlanta, I went to my first Morehouse College football game, and I remember riding home and saying I'd never seen so many black people in one place in all of my life. Pittsburgh was, the schools we attended were quite integrated then. We at Spelman were very much influenced by a man who taught us, not that our parents hadn't, but who reinforced that you just don't talk about discrimination, you try to do something about it. That's Dr. Howard Zen. And for those of you who don't know, he did die only in January of 2010. He will be memorialized this April. Unfortunately, I missed the first year of the student movement. I was studying abroad at the Sorbonne in Paris. But it was appropriate because that was the eve of independence of virtually all of the 14 sub-Saharan African former colonies of France. And the student organization FEANF, Fédération des étudiants de l'Afrique noire française, was very active. It was also during the period of the Algerian Civil War. And I remember vividly how de Gaulle's soldiers were patrolling the Algerian quarters with armed machine guns. My students did me the favor of electing me president of the student body while I was away. So when I came back to Atlanta in September of 1960, I became active in the student movement and a co-chair with Lonnie King. There are many things that I could say about the movement. Let me just say that it was Lonnie who talked me into calling Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to ask him to join us. And I want to apologize to his family because we didn't know at the time that that was a violation of his probation. And so when we were released, really because of him, because we had gone to jail, to stay in jail, to put economic pressure on the prison system, we were very concerned about that he couldn't join us. Let me just say that the students recognized how important the media was. And on about 2 hours before 10 o'clock, on October the 19th, 1960, when 76 students demonstrated at 16 institutions at 10 o'clock sharp, someone called the press to let them know something was going to happen. And that, as you will see, was very important to our movement. Most of us during 1960-61 spent 30% of our time out of class, either in jail, on the picket lines, or negotiating. And I'm delighted to see Frank Smith, who has recently arrived, just last night or this morning, who was a very active member of our group. Most of the others, and I hope before the program ends, they will all be recognized because they all played a vital role. I have many memories of that period. I won't go through all of them. But I just want to highlight two that were really asides, but things that I vividly remember. Those of you now may or not, you may not know that then we couldn't socialize as African Americans. I guess we were Negroes then, with whites. But a group of students from Agnes Scott came over. We couldn't even serve coffee because that would have been a social event. And I remember this student saying to me, you know, I've never met any educated Negroes. You know, we had a maid, and what I recall most is whenever she ate on a plate, my mother would break it and throw it away. I have never forgotten that because I think it's a serious indictment of the way people felt about us as African Americans. The second one, I'm sure Lonnie also recalls. It was during one of the marches, and it was a rainy day, and literally hundreds of people were walking in the rain, and there was one man I'll never forget who was in a wheelchair. On that day, Malcolm X happened to be in town, and he came up and he said to us, Lonnie and Herschelle, how do you get them to do it? And we looked at him and said, we don't get them to do it. This is something we all feel compelled to do. Let me turn quickly to the observations. First of all, I think it's important to note that the civil rights movement that began in the mid-50s, obviously with the Supreme Court desegregation case, is not the first movement. It was the modern phase of the civil rights movement, but as you all know, Africans have been demonstrating even before they got on those ships in Africa. As you know, many of them committed suicide. You had a series of Back to Africa movements. We went through many periods. Cultural nationalism, black power, you name it, we've been through it. So let's recognize what we did then, and all of those who participated, was only a recent phase of what has been a long struggle. Secondly, it's important to emphasize as well that what happened in the South was made possible by our Constitution, our federal Constitution. Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. Can you hear me better now? Yes. Oh, well, if you hadn't, raise your hand and I'll thank you. It's Article 10 that reserves powers to the states. And so because of that Article 10, they were able to control voting, education, and public accommodations. But it is the preambular part that talks about justice. And so our Constitution is in many ways a contradiction, but it was the justice provisions of that Constitution that made our movement successful. The third point I've already referred to, and that's the role of the mass media. Somebody called, and the press was notified. And that was very critical, because soon as television images flashed throughout the nation, consciences were raised. And ours was the first revolution that was televised. But even as recently as the demonstrators, the pro-democracy demonstrators in Iran, they are using electronic media, text messaging, and sending cell phones, because everyone recognizes that if people don't know about it, it might as well not have happened. The fourth point I wanted to make is that even though, well, we called him ML, the nonviolent passive resistance movement was focused on moral suasion. We all knew that it was really economic pressure that would make the difference. And Martin said, he wrote in a letter in October 1961 after the Freedom Rides, and I quote, "Public relations are a very necessary part of any protest of civil disobedience. The world seldom believes the horror stories of history until they are documented via mass media." Fifth point, the civil rights movement became the model for every future demonstration in this country. The anti-war campaign of Vietnam, the women's movement, the movement of those who were disabled, the gay movement. And I think it's important to recall that our hymn, "We Shall Overcome," was what the people in Soweto in South Africa sang in 1976. When Corazon Aquino came to power in 1986, after the Marcos regime, they sang "We Shall Overcome." And when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, it wasn't the Communist International, they sang "We Shall Overcome." Sixth point, in terms of another major impact, apart from desegregation, the student movement brought about the whole suburbanization of our major cities. We call it white flight. But as the schools and public accommodations were desegregated, whites fled to the suburbs. Probably the second largest social migration in our country, following the movement of African Americans north during World War II for jobs in the manufacturing sector. Final point, no, 7. Even though it was African Americans demonstrating against injustice, and as you may recall, there used to be a thing called the, what do we call them? Affirmative action policies that have now been discredited. The point is that it's white women who have been the major beneficiaries of the changes that occurred during the 1960s. Finally, the two main lessons of these observations. First, you cannot sustain political influence if you don't have economic power. So many of us found out when we could get into the lounge counters, we didn't have the money to buy them. Second, you can change attitudes, but no, you can change behavior by changing laws, but it takes a much longer time to change attitudes. Let me move quickly. That is the segue to my next point. And let me say this more out of sadness than out of anger. It's as if the entire community at large in Atlanta has not even recognized this movement. In 1960, they printed the first appeal for human rights. In 2000, they printed the appeal 40 years later. That was our 40th anniversary. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution has not printed the appeal this year. And so that is the challenge. And I think it's a challenge to not only us, but the students. And I think in that vein, we must remember what Thomas Jefferson said: eternal vigilance is the price of democracy. Or as a black preacher said more brutally, freedom ain't free. And so you will have to accept the challenges that I think that face us. And now I want to turn briefly to those. How many minutes? I'm out. All right. Quickly, because these men have held the stage all week, and that lets me say that it may not be widely known, but I'm willing to bet that there were more Spelman students who got arrested than any other group of students in Atlanta University. Anyway, women were very, very present in the movement. Let me just tick these off. First, cut back on your Facebook time, please. Please, because it's diverting you from the real issues that will affect your future. Spend that time listening to NPR, reading the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal. Please, because I think, as the disc jockey at Howard University say, average people talk about people, more informed people talk about events, but intellectuals and leaders talk about ideas. Please, stop your Facebook time. Danny will talk about the war, but we need to get out of that war. We've lost too much in human lives and financial resources. It's a war we can't end. We need to defend our homeland from within our borders. Because this is the time we can't afford it. I'm afraid you young people will live in the 21st century that will be dominated by China and not the United States. Schools are closing, not only in DeKalb, but in Detroit. And the Board of Education of Texas has rewritten the curriculum. Now, why is that important? The curriculum for history, social studies, and economics. Because of their size, they dominate the printing of textbooks in this nation. They can involve about 80% of the textbooks in the country. You mentioned it, criminal justice, the economic conditions. You think what happened in the last 2 years were bad. Wait until 2012 and 2014 when a lot of the loans will come due. Finally, let me just say, almost finally, the new conservatives are more dangerous. They're more articulate, and the mass media makes them more ubiquitous. And so maybe it's time, after the Tea Party and the Coffee Party, to create the Cocoa Collective. But in any case, I think all of us need to focus our time on electing a Democratic governor in the state of Georgia. Let me really close now by saying, and I hope it's not considered a backing out of what needs to happen, but I have to close with another black minister because they are the fount of wisdom. He said, "We ain't where we want to be. We ain't where we're going to be. But thank God we ain't where we were. So we expect you to take us where we're going to be." Thank you.
We're going to have a change in the program at this time. Lonnie King has to leave because of family responsibilities, and he may want to say more about that. But we're going to call him at this time so that he may make his presentation. And we're trying to do this so that we will have time for the students to ask questions or make comments that you would like to make. Lonnie? Okay. And I should say that Lonnie King is the He's our leader. Lonnie was the chairperson or co-chairperson with Herschelle of the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights.
Well, let me just thank you again for giving me a chance to talk. Can you hear me? Okay, let me clarify. I was the chairman, I wasn't the co-chairman. I was chairman thanks to people like Julian Bond and others who voted for me early on, Morris Dillard, Charles Black. Herschelle was co-chairman. She succeeded John Mack, who was the AU representative on the panel. I'm going to be very brief. The 1960 appeal came about as a direct result of the intervention of the college presidents, who felt that maybe if they could convince us to write an appeal, some of our energies might be dissipated and we won't go out and do what they figured that we were going to do. But we decided to run with the foxes and chase with the hounds. That is, that we decided to go on and follow their advice and write the appeal. But at the same time, when I asked Rosalind to chair that committee, I had another committee working, planning the sit-ins. So we were working concurrently. The presidents didn't know that, but we were. I've got to tell you something about the dynamics. Maybe you heard it yesterday, but apparently the 6 college presidents had come together before we met to get a unified position. So then they called us in to talk about these proposed demonstrations that they heard that we were going to have here in Atlanta. And Dr. Clement started out, followed by Mays, Manley, and Brawley, all taking the same position. That is that we ought to go back to class. We didn't come here to save the world. We came here to get an education. But somewhere along the line, Harry Richardson from ITC, who was president there, paused for about 10 seconds before he spoke. And when he spoke, he said, "I agree with the students." Dr. Clement, I think, could have fainted. "I agree with the students. It's time for us to do something about this." And quickly, Dr. Richardson, Morris Brown, followed right up and followed Dr. Richardson. Well, Clement was able to recover, and that's when he pulled the appeal really out of the box and promised to raise the money. He raised $12,000 for us to put out the ad, and we put up $4,000 to make it happen. The college presidents, though, and I think this I understand better now than I did then, they had this responsibility for all of us. And if anyone had killed one of us or several of us, there could have been some lawsuits and all that sort of thing if it seemed as if the college presidents were endorsing our activity. So they had a heady responsibility. But we also had the responsibility of trying to not get put out of school, but at the same time join this broader movement, because everybody, including the college presidents, were being segregated downtown. So they had a dual responsibility that I think we understood, and maybe they understood us too. But we all moved forward. But bear in mind, this was uncharted territory. When we heard that the state troopers were downtown at the Capitol waiting to beat us up, there was a reasonable presumption that that was going to happen. And I never will forget Dr. Mays calling me in before we made that march on May 17th. And he said to me that Chief Jenkins has said that the State Patrol is down there ringing the Capitol. And if you come down, violence probably will break out. So as I heard Dr. Mays talking to me, I reminded him that when I was a sophomore, he made a speech in chapel called "A Morehouse Man Never Sacrifices the Principle for Peace." And I told him that, and so of course he backed down and met me at Free Street Baptist Church. But looking at it in hindsight, Mays was concerned about our safety, as all the presidents were. and therefore it was reasonable for him to have taken the position that he had taken. At the same time, it was reasonable for us to take our position. So we had two African American groups here, the students and the presidents. Both groups were being segregated against. But it was a question of, do you push now, or do you wait for the NAACP to do it in 100 years? Because I want to say to you something that is not original with me, but Martin said it, Martin King. The South is prepared for 100 years of litigation, with each right one at a time. And that's why Rosamund Polk wrote in the appeal, the first one, that we cannot sit passively by and wait for our rights to be meted out one at a time. We'd still be going through that 50 years later. The second appeal was basically just an update, and I won't get too much into that. Let me just flip into the 2010. The 2010 appeal was designed to be an evaluation of where we are. And we essentially mentioned several things that were good, that had happened, but we highlighted those two things that I talked about earlier today: the education system and the law enforcement system, and how those two things seem to be the next area where we have to have a revolution. Not an evolution now, but a revolution. But I want to also close by telling you that maybe we did do something that Dr. Mays talked about once. He said, if we can just light one candle in this great abyss of darkness, then our life here on earth will have been worthwhile. We may have lit one candle with our students today and the faculty. I was approached by someone after that meeting to talk about how we can come together to begin to deal from the gown situation, from the college situation, this whole question of the uneducation of our children. And if Morehouse College and Spelman College and Clark AU and Morris Brown and ITC all come together with a combined plan of how we can do it in Atlanta, Georgia, trust me, using the talent of Ms. Toni Mosby and Ms. Vicki Crawford and some others, Fisk will be doing it soon. Wilberforce soon. Tuskegee soon. So therefore, the appeals that we wrote were designed, and it was not an idea in the beginning, but it was designed to leave a written history that some some Negro students in 1960 knew how to use subjects and verbs and how to write poetically a document that would live forever. Thank you.
Thank you, Lonnie. Danny Mitchell is a graduate of Clark Atlanta University, and during the days that he was at Clark College, it was called Clark College at that time, he was vice chair of the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. Danny will speak to us on strategies for addressing current problems.
Spelman, Clark, ITC, colleagues, faculty, staff, community of scholars. It's my pleasure to be with you today, and this is a repeat of many times, many years ago, when I had occasions to speak to your student body as we elicited their participation in what had become daily treks downtown Atlanta to demonstrate. While we pay homage to the thousands who participated during those days, I'd like to take a moment to mention two names who were advisors to us. One, M. Carl Holman, professor of humanities at Clark College, and Howard Zinn, history professor and chair at Spelman College. They were both advisors to our group and made real contributions. To be sure, there are others, but both of them have left us. It's a pleasure for me to be here this day, this historic day. In an effort to provide a context for the challenge I will put forth to you, I'd like to start by quoting a song, a labor song, that goes like this. Freedom doesn't come like a bird on a wing, doesn't come down like the summer's rain. Freedom, freedom is a hard-won thing. You gotta work for it, fight for it, day and night for it. And every generation has gotta win it again. To the students of the Atlanta University Center, it is with great anticipation that I and my colleagues pause to mark this critical and crucial and pivotal day when you 2010 scholars are being challenged to lift the mantle again and provide new leadership to the Atlanta community. Unlike our experience as change agents, when we sought to create a mass social movement, I challenge you today to undertake the formation of something a bit different. We were involved with what became a movement. I submit to you that on this day, you should consider forming a people's organization. This would be an organization dedicated to the proposition that all people are created equal, with a list of entitlements that include equal access to good health, good housing, jobs, and quality education. The organization that I envision would seek to maximize efficiency, be capable of consistently achieving organizational victories, and routinely recruit and convert new members so as to continue the maintenance of the organization and indeed create it such that it becomes a permanent vehicle. It would understand and appreciate the role of conflict as an operational philosophy and utilize a wide assortment of organizational tools characteristic of an Alinsky-styled community organization. Among these tools would be the use of the boycott, picket lines, selective buying campaigns, sit-ins, and mass marches. It would be guided by the constructive use of power and the belief that through its use, people can better their condition. Its architects should understand that it is best to take the long view, that protracted action is apt to better position for longevity, that ideas are the important factors to remember and to follow, and not the cult of the personality. Understand that the use of direct action is a legitimate use of power, and that it should be used sparingly, if not selectively. If you elect to take up this challenge, I promise you that the generation of students that follow you will inherit a beloved community free from the inequalities that faced you upon your entry. And above all else, as I close, would you remember that when you go out into the world, watch out for traffic, hold hands, and stick together.
Thank you, Danny. Our next panelist is Dr. Robert Bob Holmes. We affectionately call him Bob. Dr. Holmes retired in 2005 as Emeritus Distinguished Professor of Political Science at Clark Atlanta University and Director of the Southern Center for Studies in Public Policy and the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute. He served in the Georgia House for 34 years as a state representative, where he served as chair of the 35-member largest legislative black caucus in the nation. We are happy to have him come and give his remarks on the economic dimension to contemporary problems. Bob.
Thank you very much, Lydia, and I'm very pleased to be here. I'm sort of the odd person out. I did not attend Morehouse, was not here in the center in 1960 when all of these events occurred. A few years earlier, I was trying to do a few things that were related to that. As a matter of fact, I was one of the 4 children who integrated high school in West Virginia. You heard about the Little Rock 9 in 1957. Well, I was one of the Shepherdstown 4, my cousin Elizabeth Ann, and 2 sisters, Molly and Charlotte Jenkins, and myself. And we were sort of, I guess you might say, really made to do this, in my sense, by what happened in 3 years earlier at Brown versus Board of Education. So we were young, but and we were foolish, as many people said. But we made it happen, and I think it was, in fact, a good thing. A little bit later, when I was at Columbia University, I guess I qualified because my son is a 1991 graduate of Morehouse College, and he always asked me, well, why didn't you go to Morehouse? What's wrong? You couldn't get in? Herschelle and I were at a little school in New York called Columbia University as grad students, but I said no, I couldn't get in. But I just want to say a few things because I think that Danny has given you some challenges, and I'm told that I need to speak a little bit about economics and what perhaps needs to be done. I wrote a little book which came out on a friend who was a graduate of Morehouse College, and we worked together for a number of years, Maynard Jackson, the first African-American mayor of Atlanta. And one of the things that he looked at very clearly were the disparities in terms of economics. You know, you all know the data. You know, that blacks are like 2.5 times to be more likely to be unemployed. They're 3 times as likely to perhaps be discriminated against in terms of loans in order to start their particular businesses and on and on. And it's always easy to point out these disparities, but the problem is how you, in fact, do something about it. And one of the things that Maynard's grandfather told him about, Mr. John Wesley Dobbs, who was known as the mayor of Auburn Avenue, was the need for economic development. But he went even further and he said there really is a trilogy. You know, there's like a three-legged stool, that in order for blacks to be free, in order for blacks to improve, and for the welfare of the black community to move on and upward, you had to deal with three things. One was the book, another was the ballot, and the other was the buck. And you know what the book is about. The book is about education. And Mr. Dobbs was certainly someone who pushed that, encouraged his daughters, who were all graduates of Spelman College, and all of them were honor students. And of course, likewise, he pushed Maynard in that particular direction, and any youngsters that he had an opportunity to talk to and their parents, to in fact make sure that black students, black children did in fact, equip themselves with the tools. And there was reference made to Dr. Mays, and even though I wasn't here, I did have the opportunity to read a few of his things. And one of the things that he said was that low aim, not failure, is a sin. In other words, you need to sort of, set your goals high and to do whatever is necessary in order to achieve them. And I think that that was one of the things that caused our grandmothers and parents and aunts and uncles to tell us that get your education, because they, meaning white folks, couldn't take it away from you. And that would in fact equip us to in fact begin to show leadership and to do those things that are necessary. The ballot is obvious. As you know, the civil rights movement started out in terms of how we get our basic God-given rights. And the idea, of course, of politics is that, as Maynard used to say, only public officials can make public policy. You can be a professor and write about a lot of things, and you can lead marches and things of that nature, but ultimately, the changes are going to be made when you're in a position of political power, representation, and influence in order to be able to pass those laws and to change policy. As was said, you may not be able to change attitudes, but some people grudgingly know that there are consequences to violating the laws, and so you always need to have that. And of course, that's one of the things that I sought to do. As was said, I was in the Georgia General Assembly for 34 years, and one of the sad things was that many people said, you were in there for so long and there was never a taint or inkling of so-called unethical behavior. And I said, well, I had a 90-something-year-old grandmother who taught me that you always do what is right. And what I got into the legislature was for not my own personal benefit, but to try to do things for people who were not in a position to do those. And that's why I did an awful lot of crazy things, like opposing the speaker during my freshman year when I asked him 2 questions, and to which he gave the wrong answer. I said, Mr. Speaker, why is it that there are no African Americans on the Budget Committee? They dole out a budget of funds and services and everything, like 11 or $12 billion. He said, well, I know the right people to point to these committees. I said, wrong answer. And then I asked him, well, why were no urban legislators? Because, the rural legislatures, of course, dominated. And he said basically the same thing. Well, I said, Mr. Speaker, I've got to point your I've got to support your opponent, for the office of Speaker. And my colleagues told me that, hey, you're crazy. You'll never be a committee chairman. You'll never be this or be that. But it so happens that my urban legislative buddies and members of Black Caucus finally got the gumption to, in fact, say to Mr. Speaker, well, we need some representation. And guess who became the first African American on the Budget Committee? Because they thought I was crazy enough that I would, stand toe-to-toe and battle it. So I think that's what these students did. They provided leadership. And it said that leadership is based on 2 things, foundation. Lao Tzu, Herschelle knows that one of my areas in grad school was China, said that you lead by example. And he also said that it's someone who is a servant leader. We read about that in the Bible. And that was my notion as well. And that's what this movement was about, of the students. And I think, as the Bible says, and the children shall lead them, that's what they did really with adults. Danny indicated and Lonnie indicated that these folks were reluctant here in the AU Center to rock the boat. They were in fact reluctant to do some things that needed to be done. They were waiting to go slow. And they were great men, back in the 40s when they helped to do some things after the end of the white primary in 1947, the Primus King case. And of course, they began to register voters, and the mayor, for the first time, Hartsfield basically said, I can pay attention to you now, because when they wanted to have streets paved and lights on their streets, and to have black policemen hired, and to get parks in their communities, that they then were willing to listen to him. So much for the ballot and buck. The third thing, and that's what I'm going to focus on for about 2 or 3 minutes, is this notion of course, the buck. The idea here is that black people do in fact need to not use the capitalist system as their model in terms of what can and what should be done and how we can move. And there are a lot of models, alternative models that I think we need to focus more on, and we need to think about how we can in fact do these things which will enable black people to prosper a great deal more. I'll just mention 5 of these. One is simply cooperatives. You hear about co-ops in terms of housing and condominiums and things of that nature, but it in fact offers an opportunity to do those kinds of things in retail, in manufacturing, in grocery stores and things of that nature. And back in 1971, the year I came to Atlanta, we set up a little co-op in conjunction with, I guess we call an African-centered school that our children, our grandchildren and children were going to. And you could set up stores, grocery stores. There's no reason why people in various neighborhoods, you have a system here in Atlanta now, the neighborhood planning unit, you could even use those as sort of models. The city is divided up into, contiguous neighborhoods, and you need to think in terms of if you in fact would pool your resources together, that you could set up stores, you could set up companies. In other words, the capitalist model is not in fact going to work because we don't have the capital individually to in fact, do those things that need to be done. I think the second thing that we need to think of is in terms of lending institutions. As was said, I think you need to practice what you preach. I had the good fortune, with the blessings of the Almighty, to in fact help to organize 2 banks. One headquarters is just a couple of blocks up the road, Capital City Bank. And we now have 7 branches. We're in Savannah, we're in Augusta, and we're also in Albany, and we're at the airport, and we're a few other places. But the bottom line is here, we need to think in terms of setting up our own lending institutions. You have all the economic data to show you, it comes out from the Federal Reserve Board and others, to in fact say that there's still discrimination in terms of loans. Black businessmen who are aspiring to start their businesses or in fact to enhance and to grow their businesses, they're discriminated against in terms of being given loans at higher rates, than white businessmen, and given a lesser amount. If they want $500,000 for capital equipment, they may be able to get $250,000. Instead of getting prime plus 1, they get prime plus 3 rates. And in order to do that, one of the things that I was able to do as well was become involved in a majority white bank up in Cherokee County. And after we sold that, then I was able to become involved in doing that. We also need to think, in terms of what we have and what we can have and build in is at churches. If you don't want to go the private banking, and one of the great things about this bank were many of the founders were people who had been discriminated against by white banks. The guy who had a few McDonald's, 3 of them, he couldn't get a loan from then C&S Bank in Atlanta, the largest bank, in order to do that, and that's one of the reasons he wanted to set up his own bank. But we have in these churches, we have these credit unions, and we can in fact, again, use those. You have them on your job, you have them in various major corporations, but if you can get several hundred people to pool their resources, once again, and set up these credit unions, because that's absolutely essential in terms of how, in fact, you build an economic base in the community. And I think we need to do more of those. These are challenges all to the students. I'm sort of looking to the future. They've reflected on the past. I think those are some of the kinds of things that you need to do. You need to encourage and get through the government various types of incentives that are built in, such as enterprise zones. You can have housing enterprise zones to build affordable and low-income housing where you get various kinds of tax breaks. You can have mixed use. You can have commercial, retail and housing and various kinds of things. And you need to, in fact, learn about the process to, enhance your understanding about what kind of resources are out there and to, in fact, take a leadership role. One of my good friends, Ed Irons, when he was the dean of the School of Business, I asked Ed, I said, why are there no courses in entrepreneurship at the Atlanta University School of Business? That just amazed me when I came here. My background is in economics and politics, but the bottom line is that we need to make sure that the children have aspirations and are in fact inspired to not only spend their 30 or 35 years in the workforce, working for a Fortune 500 company, they need to think in terms of how they can go out, use their skills, as I said, back to the book, and to help do these things in the black community, help to organize things like the co-ops, help to organize things like the credit unions in order to not only make a living themselves, but to in fact help their community. And that's one of the important things I think we have to remember. One of the most important books I ever read in my life was a book by Crane Brenton called Anatomy of Revolution. And what he did, he wrote about what all the major revolutions, in Nasser in Egypt, Mao Zedong in China, and Lenin, of course, in the Soviet Union, on and on. And he found that there was one basic principle that these folks had. They had, in fact, a mission. They had a purpose in life. And they decided to give up all that they could have been. In other words, they could have easily become a part of, the cog, the machine, the existing society. But their higher purpose was to do things that were better for their particular nation, for their particular community. And so they were willing to give that up. And I think that that is really what your challenge is, in fact, not to be a part of the me generation, which allegedly we were part of, but to be a part of the we generation. That is to do those things that will in fact benefit your community. One of the greatest living symbols, of course, of this was Dr. Martin Luther King, who gave his life. You may not need to do that, but I think that you need to think in terms of what your legacy is going to be. The Greeks used to ask the question about a person who had recently passed, did they live their life with purpose and passion? And I would ask the question, when you leave here, do you want your life to read, or your legacy to be, that you in fact helped others while you were here and you left the world a better place than when you found it? Thank you very much.
Please give these panelists another round of applause. They have certainly given us valuable information. If you have a question, please come forward. Please come to this point. You can just line up if you like so that we will have use of the mic. Are there questions or comments?
Check 1, 2.
You can use the mic right over to my right here. Questions, comments? Well, I want to tell you how the Committee on Appeal was formed while people may be coming up to the mic. Lonnie King was a student at Morehouse College, and he called the top 3 officers from each of the other schools to a meeting. At that particular time, I was secretary of the student government at Clark, and each one of us got involved. In fact, we formed the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights. That has not come up during the weekend, and I wanted to make sure the students and everyone understood how the Committee on Appeal was formed. Okay, are there other questions or comments? Other comments or questions? Yes.
I think that Dr. Holmes has really touched upon and in fact addressed.
I don't know if they can hear you, Johnny.
Dr. Holmes has truly addressed, I think, the critical issue, and that's one of the issues that very honestly may not have been addressed by us 50 years ago, and it lingers, that failure to address, and that's the economic issue. If you look at any African American community in this country, not just the South, throughout this country, you will find that there are businesses that are owned by people other than African Americans. And as I remember a very distinguished Republican, Arthur Fletcher, once stated that the very reason for this is it's a community that largely trades in cash. And this is how millionaires are made. They determine what is reported to the IRS because they get their money in cash, and you see generations moving on There's, as a matter of fact, I can recall vividly back in the 50 years ago, the Jewish merchants largely were dealing with, they ran the stores in the African American communities. And then eventually you have the Koreans. And throughout New York, you have now the Indians. So they have made their fortunes, educated their families, and they've moved on to other spheres. And I think that this economic issue is one that is frequently overlooked. And Dr. Holmes, I wish that you would just kind of discuss that in some greater detail, if you will.
I think you put your finger on it. It just seems to me that with any ethnic or racial group that we've had in this country, that in order to sort of cause, what do you call it, all boats to rise, it seems to me the best and easiest way to do that is to pool your resources. You even have some of the groups like the Vietnamese who come over here, and they in fact will, to buy a house, to get together a down payment, they may put in, let's say, $100 a month into a pot, and then they will draw straws to see who gets the first, down payment money. And then they'll go on to the second, the third, and fourth. We've been taken in by the Herschelle Challenor story of, rags to riches, from poor and poverty to becoming a millionaire, when we don't in fact have the resources. In other words, when you look at those disparities, most of the people who have made it, and there are of course there are exceptions in the white community, are folks who start off with an economic foundation. They could get loans from their uncles or aunts or some combination within their particular families in order to be able to start their particular business. Ted Turner is a great example. Now, he became, of course, a billionaire not without a start. His father owned a billboard company, but he had that economic base in order to be able to build on it. We usually don't even have the economic base. I was born in West Virginia. I guess that says it all. My father left when I was 5 years old. I have a brother who's a couple years older, and I never thought, as I said, except for the grace of God, my grandmama told me that, Bobby, the Lord has blessed you so you can be a blessing to others. I've also been involved in real estate as a broker. I've also owned a computer franchise and a few other businesses. But the bottom line is, I basically do not do it. You have to do it, because my grandmom said, to help others. So, for example, my wife and I have 6 rental houses. One house, 4 bedrooms, 3, 2.5 bathrooms. We rent it for $650. It's a young lady who has a wife who has 3 children. She reminded me of my mother. I said, what could you pay? That's what she pays. And things like that. So my idea is that if you have enough that you're supposed to give back, and you don't think about benefiting just yourself, but doing those things that will benefit others, and that has to be the mentality that you have in order to, as I said, take your education and to use it not only for your own personal benefit. It's not mutually exclusive. It's not mutually exclusive. And that was the idea of Capital City Bank. The idea was that many of these people, as I said, had been refused loans by white banks. That's why they did it in spite. So they were trying to help future generations, and that's what we need to think in terms of always our legacy and helping people, particularly the children, and doing those things that need to be done.
I was curious to know, like, just from your own perspectives when you were at school, like, did the student government associations separately, like individually at Spelman, have conversations with Dr. Manley? What were some of those conversations like? What were your presidents telling you?
At that time, for those students who don't know, we had to be back on campus at 6 o'clock. But he did allow me, I would always tell him, and he did give me some license. And I think he appreciated the working relationship, and that's the way I considered it. And it worked fine. He was very supportive to the extent that he could be. But he did fire Howard Zinn.
We did not have private audiences with the presidents. We dealt with them all together most of the time.
If you got 10,000 students and you got $100 per student in student activity fees, how much money is that? They don't teach math here anymore. It's probably $1 billion, I guess. I don't know. Anyhow, it seems to me that one of the things that students can do, leaders of student associations and all, can make sure that students are working together on something in the center. one thing, any one thing. I always say to students that if you're not as mad as hell about something, you ain't paying attention. You got to be really upset about something. The economy, war, environment, something. Get the food or something. Why won't you take some of your student activity fees and put it in a pool? You know, the administration may not like that a whole lot, but it's your student activity fees. They used to use them mostly for homecoming activities back in the day. They still do, right? Put a few pennies together from all the schools, put it in a pot, decide on something you want to work on together, and do that, some one thing, every year. Is that a pretty good idea?
If the students see that there's more unity between the faculty and staff of all the schools, we can get a better idea of how to lead and come together as one.
But the question would be, if the fire wasn't there, you know, you talked about a revolution occurring, and you're saying they have a mission, but part of that mission is also the oppressor, which is the person that is coming, or the antagonist that's coming against them. So I don't know. And my main question to you was, now, so I'm saying if there is no fire and we're dealing with termites, we have to be a lot smarter on how we're going to do this.
The people's organizations were democratically formed by representatives from neighborhoods who came together. And in some cases, like Syracuse, New York, we built 9 such organizations. And then we had what was called an organization of organizations, which took representation from the individual neighborhoods into a community-wide mass organization. And we planned, we didn't have fires going all the time, but systematic planning of action campaigns, okay? Where you sometimes set your opposition up, and when they went for it, you know, you moved ahead and systematically moved ahead. And it was about building, recruiting people on an ongoing basis, converting these people in terms of their thinking around ideas, right? And then implementing on that and continuing that process of recruitment, conversion, maintenance, etc. And then passing the mantle on to the next generation so that there was continuity.
Let us also recall that the Hispanic vote for Obama was absolutely essential. And I think in many communities you do have that kind of cooperation. Bring us our tired, you know, it bothers me when we talk like that. Who supports most African American ventures? It's white people, many of them Jewish Americans. So I think that while undocumented present a challenge, we have to try to get them documented or work for that, or if we know they're taking our jobs, and we just have to study harder. You know, the problem for many of the young men who are in prison isn't just the undocumented. There are a series of factors. So I think we ought to look at these things a bit more carefully. And I know it's a very complicated issue, but I get a Pavlovian reaction when we say, oh, no, I don't want any immigrants. We're a nation of immigrants.
This is just the opening, and it's been a wonderful celebration. And I want to give all of you a hand again.